All right. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation on trans inclusion in athletics. My name is Dr. Alicia Johnson. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I am the director of the Women's Center here at UW Oshkosh. Dr. Liz Cannon is the LGBTQ plus Resource Center Director, pronouns AM. Currently, Dr. Cannon is managing a furnace replacement and will be joining us in a little bit. And so I am going to go ahead and get us started. And this is the first presentation or first event in UW Oshkosh's Transaction Week. So I encourage you all to look for additional programming happening this week to help us promote trans inclusion in various spaces. To get us started, I wanted to just highlight a couple of truths that frame this presentation. And so these are important for you all to be aware of and to know that these are truths that help kind of frame the argument and frame the content of this presentation. So the first one is that sex and gender are socially constructed and neither is binary. And so this is something that comes out of women's and gender studies and other fields of study. But it's important to recognize that both sex and gender are socially constructed. We as humans have created these sort of arbitrary boundaries around what counts as sex, what counts as gender, and categories within those two. And there are more than two categories for both sex and gender, and we'll come back to that in just a little bit. So it's also important to know that sport conflates sex and gender. So oftentimes sex and gender are used interchangeably in the world of sport, but really most often they're talking about sex and not gender. But it is important to recognize that sex and gender are separate constructs. And this is just a little safe training 101 with looking at the difference between sex and gender. So we talk about the assigned sex at birth to highlight that it is often a medical professional who is assigning a sex at birth, most often primarily based on external genitalia. But sex is actually much more complicated than just external genitalia. It also is comprised of internal reproductive organs, chromosomes, hormones, and secondary sex characteristics. So the terms that we use when we're referring to assigned sex at birth, when sex and gender are not conflated, include male, female, and intersex. And then when we think of gender, we think about a person's internal sense of self. So only a person, an individual knows what their gender is, and then they can choose to communicate that with the external world. And some terms that you might see when we're talking about gender include woman, man, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, genderqueer, and so many, many more. And so I just wanted to give that frame just so that we're all on the same page about the differences between sex and gender. And they are separate constructs, but they are certainly related or interact with one another when we're talking about kind of the broader picture of how people function in society. Another thing that I wanted to note is that gender is both produced and reproduced in sport. So one example of gender being produced in sport is this establishment of gender or sex boundaries, those boundaries being contested or negotiated. And what we're talking about today, I'm going to give you a little bit of the history and background of the practice of sex verification and testing in sport. That's an example of this attempt to kind of produce or put the boundaries on what counts as gender or sex. And then it's also reproduced in many different ways, especially around the expectations of women athletes to maintain and perform femininity within sport. And so we kind of see this production and this reproduction of gender in different capacities within sport. The last truth that I wanted to highlight is that intersex rights are human rights and trans rights are human rights. So these are truths that we hold. We're not here to negotiate them. Um, and this is what really we're talking about today is how do we uplift and secure trans and intersex rights as human rights. So I'll give you a very, very brief history of sex and gender testing in sport. This is much more complex and in depth than what we can cover in an hour. But if you want to follow up and have conversation with me, I always welcome that. And I have some resources at the end too if you want to dig into this topic further. So you can see at the bottom of the slide, these are all of the different names that the international community has called this um, this practice of sex and gender testing. So it's been sex testing, sex verification, sex check, sex control, femininity tester testing, gender tester testing, gender verification, and women's medical examination. So you can see that even by the name of the test, there's this conflation and interchanging of gender and sex and also sometimes femininity. Another thing that's important to note is that, so we're going to talk about the International Olympic Committee and their policies and kind of the history, their role in history. And what's important to note is that they often set the standard along with international sport governing bodies. So it is typically the IOC or the International Olympic Committee and the international sport governing bodies, usually the IAAF or the International Athletics Association, so track and field, as we know it here in the US. But you can also think about other international sport governing bodies like FIFA is a very popular, perhaps well-known international body. So oftentimes it's these kind of international groups that set the standard, and then the national sport governing bodies follow suit or make maybe slight adaptations specific to their sport. And then collegiate athletics here in the US, so governed currently by the NCAA, they will take into consideration what the IOC and the international sport governing bodies have put forward as policies around inclusion. And then the interscholastic or K through 12 athletics that follow suit from the NCAA. So you can see that it's really the IOC who leads or most often leads the conversation around trans and intersex inclusion in athletics. It's also important to think about what is the purpose of the test. So this long history and practice of trying to verify a person's gender or sex really quickly evolved from trying to detect sex imposters, as they were called at that time, to being a tool to eliminate competitors whom it deemed too strong, too fast, too successful, or too unfeminine for women's competition. So what you're going to see is throughout this presentation and this um, overview of kind of the history is that there's a lot of policing happening around women's competition in particular, and most often around femininity explicitly. So in 1936, so a couple decades into the modern Olympics. And so there were some gender segregated practices and exclusion in the ancient Olympics and earlier on. But here we'll start with 1936. So this was the Olympic year that sex verification was formally introduced. Um, there was concern of what they referred to as gender fraud because two athletes who had competed in women's sports or competed in women's sports before they physically and socially transitioned. And what also happened during the 1936 Olympics is that the American runner Helen Stevens became the first athlete to be subjected to a visual inspection because her competitor, Stella Walsh, suspected she was really a man. And upon her death, an autopsy determined that Walsh was actually intersex. And so I bring in this example because it's important to understand how internalized oppression also plays a role in this, the development of policies around trans and intersex inclusion or exclusion. And oftentimes, so as we saw in the case of Stella and Helen here, when I just mentioned that, they really it could be seen as a deflection practice or as a self-preservation strategy for Stella to be able to continue competing. And what we know, like well beyond sport, is that inequitable spaces fuel horizontal hostility. We see this a lot with women, kind of not being in solidarity with other women, but really trying to like beat them out for the little recognition or the one seat at the table that is available. So by creating more equitable spaces, we also can help combat internalized oppression. So again, this is a very long history that we don't have time to go into in depth today. But there is this evolution of testing, and it kind of works its way through those 5 characteristics of sex that we talked about earlier. And so it started with what were deemed naked or nude parades. They were also called peek and probe exams. So this was where those competing in women's athletics would have to walk naked in front of a panel of medical professionals who either visually inspected or, if needed, kind of peeked and probed around to essentially verify that that person was in fact a woman and could then compete in women's athletics. If you think about, especially like on the international level, you go to the Olympics, it's probably the biggest platform that you're ever going to compete on. One of the highest levels of competitions that you could have in your life. And first, before you can even think about kind of gearing yourself up mentally for that performance, you have to go through this really invasive and dehumanizing exam. So after the naked parades kind of received some resistance and some pushback, the IOC and international community moved on to chromosome testing. So they have tried both the bar body test and the SRY test. And then after they deemed that chromosome testing was often inaccurate or didn't really get them the results they were looking for in terms of kind of what they framed as a level playing field, which we'll come back to in a little bit, they moved on to hormone testing and specifically testosterone testing. So in all of these tests, after somebody passed their test, they would get a gender certificate or what some women athletes would call their fem cards. And so they would carry these around the Olympic Village. And if anybody had suspicion that they were not, in fact, a woman competing in women's sports, they could flash their fem card and say, nope, I passed the test, which, is also problematic in terms of requiring someone to carry um, proof or verification. So it's important to note that only athletes competing in women's sports have ever been required to participate in these tests. So there's been went on to kind of from like everyone getting tested who was competing in women's sports to now just on occasion or on suspicion. So that kind of mandatory testing was abandoned in 2000. But sex testing does still occur in the international games based on suspicion, which leaves a lot of space and room for bias. So this is one of my favorite articles from my sports studies colleagues, and I think this is an article that does a really nice job at framing the assumptions that kind of fuel the arguments around trans and intersex inclusion in athletics. So the first assumption of sex testing is that sex is a binary category. And we already talked about how that is not true. Um, this quote, I think, says it really clearly and nicely that a body's sex is too complex. There is no either or, rather, there are shades of difference. The next assumption of sex testing practices is that sport is a level playing field. And we know that in many ways, sport is far from a level playing field, nor, we could question if it should be a level playing field. And so, just another quick passage that sport as a level playing field is neither an organizational reality nor a possibility, given the historical and contemporary social, economic, and cultural arrangements of sport. So this highlights how women and other marginalized groups have historically been left out or excluded from participation in athletics and in sport. And that history impacts our present day still. The next piece is that the way that sport organizations police unfair advantages is not implemented consistently for all physical advantages. Given that sport governing bodies tolerate myriad physical advantages that are not available to nor attainable by all athletes. And so this is highlighting how it's sort of an unfair target on one aspect of a person's identity, and in this case, biological sex. That is kind of has become the focus, but there's not a discussion about other physical advantages, and there's no efforts to police those physical advantages. So a classic example is Michael Phelps, right? So Michael Phelps dominated the swim scene at the Olympics, is one of the most decorated Olympic athletes. And so, there's been a lot of conversation about the different ways in which his body was essentially made for swimming, right? And in particular, the butterfly stroke. And so it's not only his wingspan or his arm span. So he has an 80-inch wingspan, which gives him significantly longer than average arms, even for someone his height. He has relatively short legs, which help him be faster in the pool, longer torso, and exceptional lung capacity. But there wasn't a question or there wasn't any policing around these naturally occurring advantages that he has based on his body and his build. So again, trying to challenge this assumption that sport is a level playing field. Really, for those of us who love sport, we know that sport celebrates individuals who exist on the extreme end of the biological, physical, and genetic spectrum of human diversity. That's one of the beautiful things about sport is that we can see people push bodies and push our limits to new extremes or to new levels. And so trying to limit that or police that um, in one way takes away from, what people really love about sport. It's also true that it would be really challenging to fully police different advantages. And again, the current focus is on policing levels of testosterone variance in sport. So this is from a module created by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute from some of their grant funding. I have a link for it at the end if you want to go through. They have a really nice interactive module that goes through more of the more in depth about the history of sex testing. But you can see that there is a range of testosterone levels in elite athletes. So on the left are testosterone levels in elite male athletes, and on the right is the testosterone levels in elite female athletes. So you can see that for elite female athletes, there is less variance in testosterone levels, right? They're mostly concentrated below kind of that 5 threshold. But if you look at the male levels, you can see that there is much greater variation of testosterone levels. But nobody is trying to, or to date, there hasn't been an effort to regulate those who are kind of on the extreme ends of naturally occurring testosterone. So who are well above the average in men's athletics. And there hasn't been any effort to allow, say, a male athlete to, enhance with adding in testosterone to get to a more level playing field if they have naturally occurring lower testosterone. So these are kind of some of the critical questions that when we start looking at the assumptions that are fueling the creation of these policies, that we really need to think about and kind of pull on that thread. Another assumption of sex testing is that intersex athletes have an unfair advantage. We've already sort of started talking about this, but I really like this passage from the article. So the authors share that given that the logic of sport organizations and sport governing bodies are undergirded by an assumption that women are inherently physically inferior to men, they view men and intersex athletes as individuals who should be prohibited from competing with women. This logic is viewed as eliminating any unfair advantage and is said to ensure that female athletes are able to participate in sport. And given that sports are sex segregated, this further justifies the necessity to police the boundaries of sex in women's sports. So again, it's just highlighting that like these boundaries are really arbitrary, right? And they're constructed in a way to keep out people who kind of expand the boundary from what has been established. I also really like this perspective from Aaron Bucevis, who is a law professor at Western New England College and another lead scholar in this area. So Aaron shares that women are not categorically athletically inferior, but there are both socially constructed as well as biological differences between men and women that influence athletic outcomes. Women's historical exclusion from sport and the strained relationship between athleticism and femininity have and continue to suppress women's athletic interests and abilities. In addition, women are generally, though not categorically, disadvantaged in terms of the physical characteristics we associate with athleticism and have constructed concept of athleticism to showcase. So again, it's really highlighting how we have socially constructed and historically constructed athleticism to align with masculinity and as antithetical to femininity. So kind of reframed, what I like to share with students and when I'm having these conversations is that our ability to envision a world of sport not structured by binary sex or gender is clouded by historical and contemporary gender socialization and the ways in which we've been indoctrinated in the sex gender binary in and beyond sport. So it's really hard to think about for individuals to think about what sport might look like if it wasn't organized on based on binary sex and gender. And so kind of in some of my teaching experience and having these conversations, it's been really interesting to teach students from different disciplines. So when I was teaching in a kinesiology department, oftentimes I would have to do a little more background discussion on gender and sex and really help students think beyond the binary in that way. When I'm teaching in women's and gender studies, oftentimes those students are already engaged in thinking beyond the sex and gender binary, but maybe need a little more background in sport. And so I think that highlights the really unique opportunity to invite conversations that are interdisciplinary so that we aren't limited by our own biases or by our own histories. And so really thinking about moving forward toward inclusion and expansiveness, then bringing diverse thought to the table is important. So currently, there's a lot of language on the need to quote unquote protect women's sports. And this is actually a form of benevolent sexism. So there's hostile sexism and there's benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is sort of that overt, very clearly identifiable sexism that we might see in the workplace or in our daily lives. And then there's benevolent sexism, which is kind of this um, belief of putting women on a pedestal that they need to be protected because they're fragile, and this protection needs to come from men. For those of us who are here at UW Oshkosh, actually one of the leading scholars around hostile and benevolent sexism is just right up the road from us at Lawrence University. So I encourage you to look up Peter Glick's work. He's done a lot of really, really great research around hostile and benevolent sexism that we can then bring to our understanding about current arguments of trans inclusion in sport. So it's important to note, and again, we're kind of building from that international perspective. So the top or the widest layer um, of that triangle that I showed you earlier on, but really, and then it kind of trickles down. And so it's important to remember that the ultimate goal of these sex verification tests or these sex tests is to preserve white Western femininity. And scholarship has really shown this to be true in many different capacities, but in sex verification practices in particular. And it's important to note also that the white Western femininity is perceived to only be available to cisgender heterosexual women. And this is where, we begin to see the exclusion of trans athletes, and in particular, trans women and girls. It's also important to note that sex verification practices are a gender, racial, and spatial justice issue. So what we see in the international community, most often it is people with Black and brown bodies that are targeted in these sex verification practices. And so we need to look at this from an intersectional lens. So a couple of just points to reinforce. So like I started with in the beginning, trans women, trans girls are girls. That is a truth we hold. And Chris Mosier, who is a trans athlete, um, he has this quote that I think is really important. So trans girls are girls. When a trans girl participates on a girls team, there are still 0 boys on that team. And again, this reinforces that trans girls are girls. So I'm going to highlight a couple of sport organizational policies just so that folks have an understanding of the policies that already exist. So this is separate from the laws that have been introduced, but these are sport governing body policies that are currently in place. So the International Olympic Committee, or the IOC, in 2015, that's the last time that they updated their policies on trans athletes. And what you'll see throughout all of these policies is that there has been more of a focus on policing trans women and girls in sport versus trans men and boys. And this connects to the underlying assumption that a person assigned female at birth will always be inferior to a person assigned male at birth. And that's something that we want to challenge. So the IOC states that a person who transitions from female to male can compete in the male category without restriction. So really no policy. And then those who transition from male to female are eligible to compete in the female category under all of these different conditions. So they have to declare that their gender identity is female. That declaration cannot be changed for a minimum of 4 years, um, which is another kind of assumption that it's something that would be changed or reversed, right? Like that's a misunderstanding about trans identities. Um, that then there's also policing of the level of testosterone in a person's blood. And so there's kind of all of these additional requirements. And I'll make these slides available so that if people are interested in looking at the specifics, you can come back to them. Two athletes that, excuse me, have been in the media a lot in the last decade or so is Caster Semenya and Dutee Chand, who are both sprinters. Caster Semenya is from South Africa, Dutee Chand is from India, and both have challenged these policies around testosterone limits. So both would be classified as intersex. They have hyperandrogenism. And so right now, the way that the ruling has landed is that in order to participate, they would have to suppress their naturally occurring testosterone in order to be eligible to compete in women's sports. And so that's something that continues to be challenged in the Court of Arbitration of Sport, which is kind of the international court for sport. So Dutee Chand, excuse me 1 second, I'm gonna take a sip of water. So Dutee Chand is the person who made an appeal to the Court of Arbitration of Sport that would then suspend the IOC's policies on this kind of testosterone limit. So what it did is it gave a couple of years without the policy. They employed people to do some scientific research about whether or not testosterone actually gives an unfair advantage in women's athletics. And so this is kind of the singular study that they use to reinstate the rule or the policy. So you can see that it was just about 2,100 observations that were made back in 2011 and 2013. And they concluded that there was only a significant competitive advantage in these specific athletics events. So the 400 meter, the 400 meter hurdles, the 800 meter, the hammer throw, and the pole vault. So now what we're seeing is they're putting limitations on specific competitions within a sport. And then this is kind of being generalized to other sport spaces beyond athletics or beyond track and field events. So let's see. So the Court of Arbitration of Sport did acknowledge in their ruling that testosterone regulations in women's sports are discriminatory. So they admitted that, they accepted that, but they said that the discrimination is a necessary and reasonable and proportionate means of preserving the integrity of female athletics. So again, we're seeing this kind of benevolent sexism about the need to protect women in sport. So obviously, COVID disrupted the Tokyo 2020 games, but what was kind of happening leading up to the planning of Tokyo 2020 was that the IOC was trying to create stricter rules for trans athletes. Even though scientists from different disciplines had not been able to reach an agreement on what the revision should be, because there still is not clear and consistent research that testosterone always provides this significant competitive advantage. So the IOC is essentially still trying to pass the buck to the individual sport federation so that they don't have to make the policy, but so that the individual governing bodies have to do it. And their rationale for this was that they think trans policies are tricky and political, is how they described it. And one proposal that had been put forth was that there was a creation of testosterone upper limit for competing in women's sports, and that upper limit was 5, which would cover most but not all athletes competing in women's athletics. So kind of coming down to the NCAA or to collegiate athletics, these are the policies that were put in place in 2011 and still stand today. So we can see that a trans male student athlete who has received a medical exception for treatment for hormone replacement treatment or testosterone may compete on a men's team, but is no longer eligible to compete on a women's team without changing the team status uh, to a mixed gender and mixed sex team. And then a trans female student athlete being treated with testosterone suppression has to can continue competing on a men's team, but cannot compete on a women's team without changing it to a mixed team status until they complete 1 calendar year of testosterone suppression treatment. So these sort of calendar year requirements pose a challenge for a collegiate athlete in particular when they only have maybe 4 years of eligibility. They can get 5 years if they take a medical red card, which this could potentially qualify for. But again, it's impacting them in many different places of their life as well, of not just within sport in terms of like delaying graduation and things like that. And then the policy also reads that any trans student athlete who is not taking hormone treatment related to gender transition may participate in sex-separated sports activities in accordance with his or her assigned birth gender. And this is the direct language from the policy. A trans male student athlete who is not taking testosterone related to gender transition may participate on a men's or a women's team, but a trans female um, student athlete who is not taking hormone treatments may not compete on a women's team. So we see again, like these policies are really hinged on testosterone. And then if we think about the next level down is the high school level or the K through 12 level. So this is a map of different policies that that was accurate as of August of 2020. We know that there have been different bills and laws introduced that might change the way that this map currently looks. The dark gray is that there's no state guidance. The green is friendly state guidance. The blue, which is where Wisconsin is sitting, is that guidance requires medical proof and or an invasive disclosure or procedure examination. And then the pink is discriminatory state guidance that includes multiple harmful components. So we can see there's really different policies out there. So it'd be helpful to have some protection from discrimination at the federal level. And this is Wisconsin's um, current policy for interscholastic athletics, so for K through 12. And you'll see that there are lots of requirements that a person has to meet or to go through in order to compete in a sport where it aligns with their gender identity and not with their sex assigned at birth. So some examples of documentation that they have to provide is that they have to provide their current school registration information, a written statement from the student and the parent or guardians affirming the consistent gender identity and expression to which the student self-relates. The documentation from individuals, such as, but not limited to, parents, friends, and or teachers, which affirm the actions, attitudes, dress, and manner, and demonstrate the student's consistent gender identification and expression. And written verification from an appropriate healthcare professional, either a physician or a psychologist, of the student's consistent gender identification and expression, which can also be a barrier because access to healthcare professionals who are trained or might be able to provide that written verification are not widely available across the state or across the nation. So um, further on in the policy, so this is still the Wisconsin interscholastic policy, they also have to provide medical documentation. So a female to male student who has started hormone therapy is only eligible for male teams. The hormone supplementation is allowable in this situation consistent with the WIAA policy. But if a female to male student who has not started hormone therapy may participate on a female team if desired by the student, as there would be no concern, and again, this is like direct quote, as there would be no concern about safety or competitive equity without biological interventions having been implemented. So again, we're seeing this assumption that women or people who are assigned female at birth are always and forever inferior to people assigned male at birth. The next paragraph says that a male to female student must have 1 calendar year of medically documented testosterone suppression therapy to be eligible to participate on a female team. So again, thinking about the sort of time limitations of participating in, say, high school athletics, right? You're only there for 4 years. So you're essentially losing 1 year of competition because of this policy. And then, this is actually one of the first places that I've seen a note about the hormone supplementation or suppression therapy when supervised by a licensed physician does not violate a performance enhancing supplement policy. So that's often been a critique of like the IOC policies and the NCAA policies, is that testosterone is a banned substance. So there is often not a concern about a trans male athlete taking testosterone, again, because the underlying assumption is that a person assigned female at birth, even if taking testosterone, cannot outperform or win against a person assigned male at birth. And then this is the last part of the policy for Wisconsin interscholastic athletics, is that so the school is making the decision, and then they communicate their decision with the WIAA in writing. And then the WIAA essentially like reviews the materials and then approves the school's ruling or challenges it. And Dr. Rachel McKinnon, who is a trans athlete herself, she shares that this approach on requiring medical intervention already treats trans women as really men or male who may only become women as after sufficient medical intervention. And so this is something that we can challenge, and again, of reinforcing that trans women and girls are women and girls. This is also a recent article from, actually just from March 16th, from the Scientific American, in support of trans girls being included without these kind of additional requirements or barriers to be able to compete in girls' sports. So one quote that I pulled from this article is that it turns out, and so they're talking about a recent um, state competition. So it turns out that when transgender girls play on girls' sports teams, cisgender girls can win. In fact, the vast majority of female athletes are cisgender, as are the vast majority of winners. There is no epidemic of transgender girls dominating female sports. Attempts to force transgender girls to play on the boys' team are unconscionable attacks on already marginalized transgender children, and they don't address a real problem. They're unscientific, and they would cause serious mental health damage to both cisgender and transgender youth. So I thought that was a really powerful quote from this article. So we're getting close to some questions and some discussion, but these are some critical questions that I challenge students when I'm having this conversation, but I also challenge you to ask about the practice of sex testing or trying to place these arbitrary boundaries on femininity and on womanhood within the realm of sport. So first question is, why are only women's sports competitors tested? Right? So connecting back to that history, we can also ask, why is men's sports performance held as the comparative standard for all sports performance? Again, kind of highlighting that sexism and that bias. Does sex testing equate speed and strength to masculinity and as antithetical to femininity? So far, the answer to that is yes, as we've talked about throughout the presentation. Why aren't the unfair advantages in men's sports monitored? Is it ethical to rely on suspicion to initiate sex testing? Is sport ever truly a level playing field? And how might the practice of sex testing and these policies around trans and intersex athletes in sport reinforce sexism and racism on a global scale? So right now, a lot of the conversation is focused on the US, whether it's through collegiate athletics or K through 12 athletics, but really, as we've talked about, this is a historical and a global issue. So this is also something I like to put forth when I'm having this conversation with students. So if worldwide athletics administrators truly believe that testosterone is the singular distinguishing characteristic of elite athletic performance, and if we were to accept this premise, then shouldn't sex and gender be a non-issue? So perhaps competition categories should be based on testosterone ranges instead of sex or gender. It would still ignore advantages and disadvantages based on other characteristics such as wingspan or arm span in swimmers like Michael Phelps, weight in ski jumping, where you can, if you're lighter, you can be suspended in the air for longer. Um, but this is just something to kind of challenge us to think beyond our the ways in which we've been historically socialized around gender, and to try to unlearn some of that and think in a really expansive and broad way. So I also wanted to make sure that folks were aware that the current number of bills that have been introduced, which is in the double digits, I don't know the exact number, it is widely recognized as a coordinated attack on trans folks by the Alliance Defending Freedom. And the ADF is a US-based conservative Christian legal advocacy group that has been labeled as an anti-LGBTQ hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. So that, I think that's important information to know, is that these laws aren't being introduced just kind of by chance in different states. It's actually part of a larger coordinated effort. And this is a quote from the ADF Legal Counsel, and it really reinforces what their assumptions and their perceptions are. So they said allowing males to compete in the female category isn't fair and destroys girls' athletic opportunities. Males will always have inherent physical advantages over comparably talented and trained girls. That's the reason we have girls' sports in the first place. And a male's belief about his gender doesn't eliminate those advantages. So again, it's not recognizing trans girls as girls. It's really reinforcing these assumptions around people assigned female at birth and their athletic inferior eh, sorry inferiority. And I also like to point out that, oftentimes the news focuses on the folks who are opposed to trans inclusion in sport, but I like to highlight the people who are voicing support. And I think that's really important as well. So there's more than 200 athletes, professional athletes, well-known athletes who support trans youth participation in sports. And so I think it's important to recognize that there are allies that exist that are advocating for inclusive policies rather than exclusionary policies that leave out trans athletes. All right, so just as a summary, there's a long and enduring history of policing femininity through sport, all of which we could not get through today. There's no clear or consistent scientific evidence that assigned male at birth athletes are athletically superior in every way to assigned female at birth athletes. Most policies have primarily focused on excluding trans women and girls and are less concerned with trans men and boys because of that previous assumption, even if they are undergoing hormone replacement therapy and taking testosterone, which is in most cases, a banned substance. Again, reinforcing that trans women and girls are women and girls, and that we cannot let trans athletes be sort of this collateral damage or this target in the attempts to limit femininity to white, Western, cis heteronormative femininity. And it's important to note that inclusion is the way forward, not exclusion or segregation. There have been some discussions about having like separate sport categories for trans athletes, but that is not feasible because that would assume that there are enough trans athletes to make up that category and have regular competitions. And if we're going to continue, or if sport is going to continue or being organized around gender, then we need to make sure that it's as inclusive as possible until we are ready to move forward and think more expansively about how to make sport more inclusive. So I wanted to make sure that people were aware of some different resources for further education. So there's this sex verification of athletes module that was created by the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. It's something that I assign in all of my classes. It really goes into the depth and the science with the history of sex verification testing, and it's free and available on the internet. So that's a really great resource. I also really think the sex testing book by Lindsay Parks Piper is really great and details the history and the evolution of sex testing. There's also transathlete.com, which is an excellent free resource. It is largely run by Chris Mosier, again, who I quoted earlier, and is a trans athlete himself. There's also a new book. I have not yet read it, but there's a book called Sporting Gender by Joanna Harper, who is a trans woman and a scientist and an athlete. And so I imagine she puts forth very strong arguments in that book as well. There's also the Scientific American article that I quoted earlier about trans girls belonging on girls' sports teams. And then actually tomorrow at 4:30 Central Time, there's going to be a conversation hosted by the Sports Equality Foundation, which is connected to Outsports, which is a sports media outlet. And they're going to talk about inclusion in sports with trans, lesbian, and straight athletes. So they're going to talk about both the gender and sexuality aspect in sport, but that will be available free actually on TikTok, but I'm sure you can find it in other spaces as well. All right. And thank you all. I know I kind of ran us up to the end. Um, I see Liz put in an evaluation. So please do that before you head out. I'm going to stop recording.